Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you all could join us today for Kentucky Spins Lunch and Learn, currently placed in private school. We're going to go over a lot of stuff today, but let us know where you're joining from. And please let us know if you have any questions. We've got some great people on here helping as we go, and we'll address those as they come up. And hopefully you can't hear the siren in the back. But one of the things too is you'll just give us grace because we are working remotely. So there's no telling, I guess, what you're going to hear. So my four-legged baby girls may decide to bark too. So if you could just give me some grace here as we step through this. One of the things that's important to mention is a disclosure. This is not a train the trainers for you to take and go out and train others on. This presentation is for educational purposes only for yourself. Just to tell you a little bit about Kentucky SPIN, it's Kentucky Special Parent Involvement Network, and we are all individuals with disabilities and or parents or immediate family members of individuals with disabilities. Myself, I'm a sister. Three of my siblings have disabilities from the seen to the unseen, and all three had IEPs throughout school and are smarter than I could wish to be. I am OCD to the max, and we work with families to help to build partnership. And we are the Parent Training and Information Center for Kentucky and have been since Kentucky first received one through the U.S. Department of Education in 1988. So we've been around for a while, and we not only help families, but individuals with disabilities and professionals as well. So it's important to tell you what we don't do as much and much easier than what we do. We don't act as attorneys. We are not representatives for families within meetings. That's not our role. Our role is to help empower individuals with disabilities and families to effectively advocate for themselves. We do that through a peer support, being, again, individuals with disabilities and or immediate family members helping one another. And we use that, not only to share our experiences, but also to help to navigate because, having someone who has walked a similar road, I don't know how you feel, but it helps me in my everyday life. So that's what we are here for. So today's agenda is we're going to go over a lot here. And I know you'll see in the chat the PowerPoint handout that you can access as well. So we're going to look at the difference between home hospital instruction, sometimes called homebound NTI, versus parentally placed in private school or homeschool. We're also going to talk about there are some things that you need to do to be able to homeschool or send your child to a private school. Then we're going to go down and we're going to go through each one of the laws for students with disabilities and sort of explain those and how that plays a role if a child is parentally placed in private school. So it's important to first look at, because many times people get confused and think if they're on home hospital instruction or the homebound or NTI, non-traditional instruction, typically they're doing it online at home, that means that they're homeschooled. So when we say homeschool, that means that they are not enrolled in the school district. Now, this training is not covering things or going through the parts of the laws for students who are enrolled and in the public school district, or if the student was placed by the public school district in the private school. This is only parentally placed, meaning that as a parent, I've decided my child is going to go to private school or I'm going to homeschool them. Now, a good way to know is a student, if you're not sure, enrolled in the public school district, which one applies. If they're on home hospital instruction or homebound or NTI through the school district, They are enrolled in the public school district. They are just receiving their education at an alternate location versus in the classroom. So that's a huge determining factor there. Is it that they're part of the school, but just getting their school in a different location, right, than the typical classroom? Processes exist and we can help you navigate those, but that would be outside of this training because, again, I want to reinforce the things that we're talking about is parentally placed in private or homeschooled in Kentucky. So, if, let's see here, throughout we're going to talk about, again, the policies, regulations, and procedures that are specifically related for students who are parentally placed in private or homeschooled. Now, Kentucky recognizes homeschools as private elementary or secondary school. So in other words, if you have withdrew or not enrolled your child in the public school district, you're going to homeschool in Kentucky, that's viewed as the child attending a private school. Some states are different, but Kentucky views homeschooling as private school. And the thing to keep in mind when we're talking and going through the parts of the law and how it applies for students, children with disabilities, is anywhere it says private school, you'll know that that same law and process applies to your child if you're homeschooling them. So that's important to keep in mind as we go throughout this. So what do you need to do to homeschool or send your student to a private school? So on this, throughout this presentation, you're going to see tons of clickable links. Like I'm huge on wanting to make sure that everybody has access to the resources and the answers that they need. So you'll see if you come over here, you can click on these different statutes. KRS is Kentucky Regulation Statutes. And these are what's the law in Kentucky. If you're not familiar, the first one is that all students or all children or youth ages 6 through 18 are required by law to attend school. Now, there's also different parts of that law. So, because the public school district reports and keeps track of all the children, because it is a federal law that children have to go to school, of the children within it. So now, what does that mean if they're not enrolled in the public school district? It is part of reporting the name in the law. If the child's going to private school or you're homeschooling, you have to report that every year. The private school does, or you to, and if you're homeschooling, you have to report your private school, your students, because that they are attending, and you give the name of the school, the name, age of the child. For every child that say you're homeschooling, you have to report that to your district every year. And there's actually on this next screen a sample because that you can use for that. And it's not nothing complicated, but I have to tell you, it is very critical that you do this because it is a law. Because what will happen if you do not report it and you do not do the things that you have to, which is required under the law by keeping attendance records, or the school, if you don't report it, you can get it in trouble and you could have charges filed on you through the court system for truancy. We don't want that to happen. So you'll be able to, you have to keep records. Now, it doesn't mean you have to give the school the records. And if there's any requirement where someone, what's important is you report the name of the private school, the address, the age of the child, all of those things, and you do that yearly. But you'll be able to see all the details. You can click on this, and Kentucky Department of Education, or KDE, has created this information right here that you can click on. As well, KDE has a homeschool information packet right down here on the right-hand side. You can click to access that. I pulled from that right here the requirements that are set forth. Again, it takes you down through all that. The thing to keep in mind too, if your child attends a private school. It falls back on, and you will see in this previous, when you open up this private school information packet, you will see that it states that there's responsibilities for the private school. It is a responsibility of the private school to report to the local public school district the name, ages, and residence of all the pupils that are attending. Also, what happens is if they're not going to report those to it, you are supposed to be notified by the school in writing, the private school, that you're not. Then that they are not going to report it, then that responsibility falls on the parent. What I think would be very helpful is get ahead of it and ensure and ask, is the private school going to notify, or if you want to be on the safe side to make sure it happens so there's no issues with truancy, you report it as well that they're attending it, the name, age, the residence, your home residence, but then also letting them know the school they're attending, just to cover yourself so you know that it was reported. But again, it will eventually fall back as your responsibility if someone else didn't report it. And so we don't want those situations arising either. So when you look at the homeschool requirement, it's the requirements are the same regardless of if it's a separate private school or homeschooling, which is private school in Kentucky. But all the responsibility falls again on you as the parent doing the homeschooling. So you want to make sure that you have those things in there. You have to keep records of attendance. And again, there are different requirements on, it does not set in the law certain curriculum that you have to use that has to be taught. But you will see down here, there are certain subjects that have to be included: writing, reading, spelling, grammar, history, math, science, civics. You can look at those in detail here, but just so that you know, and this packet is very helpful, and just to kind of guide you through what's required. All of this is regardless if the student has a disability or not. So now what we're going to get into is, okay, now we've decided we're going to send our child to a private school or homeschool them, right? So the questions we get a lot is, okay, so people a lot of times have the understanding or are told that none of the laws apply since I sent my child to a private school. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And that's why I wanted us to take some time and have a webinar to where we kind of talked about this. So again, keep in mind, we're only if they're parentally placed in private school. And I'll give you some examples as we go throughout here to kind of show you why it's important to know the difference. And there are different parts of the law that address attending private school versus attending the public school system and requirements. So ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Most people are familiar with that because most people that know a lot about that or have heard it is that means that businesses have to have rent. Well, that's only one small section of what ADA is. Of course, that's included, but there's much more to ADA than that. Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, those are federal laws. Then you've got your Kentucky Administrative Regulation, our state law. Then you will have local policies and procedures. A private school will have their own policies and procedures, and it's going to be really important for you to know those. And I'm going to give you a perfect example as we walk through here. Then public school districts will have their own policies and procedures. And it's going to be, even though they're in private school, especially related to IDEA, it's going to be very important to understand their the district's policies and procedures. I'm going to take just a moment here and see if anybody has any questions so far.
Rhonda, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now.
Okay, awesome. Just wanted to stop there for a minute because I know that we're going over quite a bit here. So let's start with ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that is a civil rights law, and it's very comprehensive. Again, that grants access. ADA has to do with access. And what we're going to look at here, it prohibits discrimination based on disability in employment, state and local government programs, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. There's a whole variety of things that applies to. It's important to know that no funding comes down under ADA to provide funding to prohibit the discrimination, to remove barriers, right? So that's important to keep in mind too. Now, also how ADA, it doesn't matter with ADA how you get your funds. If you are a public agency, if you happen to own a restaurant in the neighborhood, it's a privately owned business. If it's a nonprofit organization, it doesn't matter how you get your funding, how ADA applies. Now, there's going to be one exception that we talk about here in a minute to that, but how you get your funding does not determine if ADA applies. Now, well, you may be wondering, okay, so is it everybody with a disability? Well, ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one major life activity. This includes people who have a record of such impairment, even if they don't currently have a disability. It also includes individuals who do not have a disability, but are regarded as having a disability. ADA makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on the person's association with a person with a disability. And most of the time people are like, and you'll see in 504 too, especially the part there of includes individuals who don't have a disability, but they're regarded as having one. And they're like, well, and I'll have people ask me, well, then how can that be if they don't have a disability? Well, think back, this is a civil rights law. If you're discriminating against me because you think I have a disability and you perceive me as having a disability, and that discrimination is because of that, then you're covered. The same is if you're associated with a person with a disability and you're being discriminated against based on that disability. That would be no different than if I was going into a restaurant with my brother who uses a power wheelchair and he was being discriminated against based on his physical disability, but then also they were discriminating against, say, I tried to stop by there a few days later and they remembered, which I wouldn't go back if they were discriminated against Grant, but for example, if say I was going back the next day to pick up an order and they remembered my brother and discriminated against me based on my brother, I would be covered and that would be unlawful, right? So again, trying to think of it that way, major life activities. It could be caring for yourself, communicating, walking, bending, breathing, thinking. It could be a whole variety of things that qualify under that. I'll also use the example of, it doesn't necessarily, I have a record of OCD, right? Like I have demonstrated it year after year, right, in my everyday life. I don't necessarily have a diagnosis of that. That doesn't mean that would not still apply to me because I have a track record of OCD, right? Of course, it can help being able to access stuff if you do have that, but it doesn't discount you if you don't. Now, so I bet you're thinking, okay, well, how does this apply if a private school? Now, one of the things in the reminder that I had said earlier, remember this is if you're parentally placed in private school and you're attending private school, because there are different titles of the law, right? So there's Title One, Title Two, Title Three, and so on. Title II of the law covers if they were enrolled in the public school, which we're not talking about now. This is strictly private school. So the things that we're going to go through here is just if they are parentally placed in the private school. Say it would fall under Title III of public accommodations in the ADA, right? And you will see down here, there's a lot of things. Lodging, it could be a hotel, food service, restaurants, bars, exhibits. What we're going to concentrate on, there's a part under public accommodations, places of education. It could be nursing school, elementary, secondary, undergraduate, postgraduate, trade or technical schools. So in other words, this means, grade school. This means school, kindergarten through 12th grade. It would fall under, for private schools, Title III, places of education. This also, you see here, undergraduate and postgraduate trade or technical schools. That also would cover you in regards to if they're not a public school, if it's, say, a private college or private trade school, then you'd be under that. Again, that kind of go back just so thinking of the transition to adulthood for the future. There are going to be parts that you would check, which we're not going to cover today, of seeing exactly where ADA would apply when you're going on to further education or any training. So just keep that in mind. One of the things, so if you're great question. So if you're homeschooling, that's not covered under Title III. Yeah, so it is, and that's a great question. It is if you're homeschooling, because in Kentucky, homeschool is considered private school. So anywhere I'm saying private school here, when we're talking about the law, it's parentally placed in private school. That also is meaning homeschool. And I'm so glad that you asked that. So right here, when we're talking about the private, private school is these things would apply. Now, you're going to be more likely, if you're homeschooling your child, you're going to provide them with the accommodations they need. Technically, you typically are not going to have the issue. And this doesn't matter if this is that are private businesses, for profit or non-profit. So since Kentucky views, and I hope that, let me know if that kind of cleared up things or if I made it more confusing. The thing about it is, whether it's homeschool or, because we consider it private school in Kentucky, you would be under the Title III places of education. So typically it doesn't become an issue because you provide that as the parents that's homeschooling them. And I'll show you the examples because here. Now, so things to mention that's really important is Title III of ADA. What does Title III of ADA require? Places of public accommodation. So one of the things here is that it is stated, and you will see here too, one thing that's important is you can also click on this ADA National Network Disability Law Handbook, and that's where this comes from. Places of public accommodation may not discriminate against people with disabilities and may not deny full and equal enjoyment of the goods or services they offer. So a lot of times people think goods and services, well, I'm not going to the grocery store. How's that apply? Well, in a private school, even if it's a private business, their goods and services is their education, is their teachers, all of that. So you can't deny me being able to go or access it just because I have a disability. Now, there is one exception, excuse me, that is within the law, is what about churches, synagogues, and religious entities? Are they exempt? Yes. in ADA, there is an exemption built in for them. And what do we mean by exemption is that for religious entities, ADA doesn't apply. Now, then there's also a lot of confusion of, but does that mean if it's just going to church, or if they have a daycare on premises, or if they have a private school that is through the church, are they exempt? Or does ADA apply? And they clarified in this, even if it is not a program or activity of religious entity, right? It's not a religious good or services that they're providing, then they're still exempt. And why is that important to know? Well, there are many religious entities that have private schools. Now, does that mean that there's nothing then there to cover? No, there's another possibility that I'm going to show you when we get into 504, but it's going to depend. But just keep in mind, if it is a private school that is run by a church, then they are exempt from these parts. So that's just important to keep in mind. Now, what funding assistance? We'd already talked about that there is not extra funding that comes down federally under ADA to businesses, to places to be able to provide them. But there is, so what about funding assistance to remove barriers and accommodate customers with disabilities? There are, which is listed here, 2 tax exemptions, incentives that you can use as a business there. Now, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a lawyer. So that would be, but keep these in mind that this might be something that could really help, that the businesses can access to remove those barriers. Now, how is Title III of ADA enforced? Well, it is through the Department of Justice. And if you find or need more information, there's a link there to it. They oversee any complaints or suits filed, you would do it through them. And, you know, one of the things, it could be a very lengthy process, but it's important to know who oversees it and how you would go about filing a complaint if you needed to. Now, so let's go into this part here of, okay, well, what does, I love that this gave some examples. So what is, and with it is reasonable, because you'll always hear reasonable modification. So businesses must make reasonable modifications in their policies, practice, procedures to accommodate persons with disabilities. So what is reasonable? Because what you think is reasonable and I think is reasonable many times do not line up. So here's some scenarios. And I'm going to show you how these, a person with a service dog tries to enter the buffet restaurant that has a no pet policy. The modification could be that the restaurant allows the person to bring their service dog in with them. And there's also some more links to, I wanted to purposely use these examples because you click on this and there's some more information about service animals, because believe it or not, this has been a huge issue for individuals with disabilities with service animals, being able to take them everywhere and even to school with them. So this would be the same case of, say, the private school had a policy of no pets allowed. A modification, a reasonable modification would be if the private school allowed them to bring their service dog with them. So a person is deaf and wants to order dinner at a restaurant. The waiter writes back, so a modification, reasonable modification would be that the waiter writes back and forth with the deaf customer to take their order. So you could apply that the same as within school. So a person who is deaf is attending the school. So they can communicate back and forth through writing. So those are going to be some things. Now, again, so I know the first question you might ask is, okay, well then do they have to provide an ASL interpreter? Well, I mean, you've got to look at, is it a reasonable accommodation? Are they reasonably, without undue hardship, able to provide that? Are there alternate means that they could provide where the student could also be able to communicate? Like that was listed here in the example, the waiter writing back and forth. Next example, a person with dyslexia requesting additional time to take an admissions exam for a private graduate school program. The testing body grants the applicant extended time for the admissions exam. This could be the very same scenario, but in a private school is they have dyslexia, they need untimed testing. Modification accommodation that they could do is that anytime that they have a test, that they're able to have untimed testing. So those are reasonable modifications. Now, let's look at a person who uses a wheelchair has difficulty accessing items at the local grocery store because hasn't been updated since before ADA was passed. So, and that's kind of an important determining factor too. Depending upon their timelines and ADA, you really want to check, especially when it has to do with physical access of stuff. It's going to depend. So this example it was before that. Well, a modification could be the store rearranges tables and displays that block access to the shopping aisles and provides a clerk to assist the customer with getting items that are out of reach. So those are readily achievable barrier removals, right? Very easy. And you will see all of these examples of what was done cost no additional money, right? These are reasonable modifications. We are not creating undue hardship with all of these modifications that were offered and provided. So one of the things too that in the school, someone in a wheelchair being able to provide the access, it would be the same if you go into the school or you go into the school, and I'm thinking of, like library, there's so many tables, and because it may be an old building that the private school's in, and you're not able to access the shelves that have the books on it. Well, it could be moving those tables that don't have enough room between them where I can access the books if I was in a wheelchair. Let's see here. I think there's, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss any questions here. I don't think I'm seeing any. Okay, so now that was ADA. And remember, the part we're talking about was Title III ADA, and that would have been public accommodations, and that would apply if you're in the private school. Now, and one of the things, because of the question that was brought up earlier, I'm going to go back here about the modifications. See, if it was homeschooled, which was a private school, any of these things you would automatically allow or work around in your homeschool, but it would be these type things if those were what was occurring that you would modify or accommodate yourself. Now, got a little trigger happy there. So Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended, it's a civil rights law. Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, just like ADA does. Now, here is the important factor here on knowing if Section 504 applies or not. Does the entity, agency, organization, whatever it is, do they receive any type of federal fund? Now, it doesn't mean do they receive disability-specific federal funds. It doesn't matter. If you receive any type of federal fund, then this law applies to you. And I know you may think, well, that couldn't be the case in private school. Well, it could. So say your private school also got federal funding and assistance through the nutrition program to provide lunches, right? Or there is a program that you have at the school, regardless if it is the program that we're talking about that is for or embedded in the homeschool. If this agency, organization, private school receives any type of federal funds, then this is going to apply and you have to abide by it. It's going to be important to check those things out. Typically, one of the easiest ways you're going to be able to tell is looking at one of the things. And I just thought of a perfect example. So remember in ADA, and thank you for the question because that made me think of that, and I'll answer that. Here's the perfect example. So many churches who also have a daycare in their church, we know that the church, that they automatically, because they're exempt in ADA, but the church has a daycare. They also have a private school. Now, the daycare accepts funds and payment for daycare through the state, which is part of federal funds that the state receives to help families be able to afford daycare. Or the example could be if it's a foster adoptive child, money that pays for that child to go to daycare is made up of state and federal dollars. That automatically just made that facility their private. Everything is going to fall under Section 504 now, and they're going to have to abide by that. Now, the question that was brought up, if a post-secondary school accepts federal scholarships, does that count? Absolutely. If, say, that it is a private college and the student was issued through federal student aid, scholarships, Pell money, Pell Grant, any of those things, and that college accepts that, they receive federal funds and they have to abide by that. So sometimes one of the important things too that I always suggest, regardless if it's a public or private school district, is get their policies and procedures. There are because many of our Catholic schools, I have looked at their policies and procedures, and many of them have a specific Section 504 part of their policies and procedures. So it's going to be important to look at those and see, but that's going to be your determining factor. Do you receive any type of federal funds? Got to know that answer before then we know what it applies. So it's important to know too, no extra federal funding comes to provide things under 504. And there are some procedural safeguards that are in place as well. So this may look very similar. This is pretty much, it is the same definition as ADA, that 504, if you qualify as an individual with a disability under this law, a person with a disability is a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. People who have a history of a disability, or people as regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Again, here are the examples that this is not the only ones that are there. But again, this is just an example of what could possibly qualify under that. So now, what does that mean? Now, when we're talking about 504 and the parts that have to do with private school, right? Because there's going to be different guidelines for a private school versus the public school. And again, if you need information on how 504 applies to the public school district, we can help you separate with that. So Section 504 prohibits organizations and employers from excluding or denying individuals with disabilities on equal opportunity to receive program benefits and services. It defines the rights of the individual with a disability to participate in, to have access to program benefits and services. So again, you can't discriminate and you can't not let me have access or to attend that school just because I have a disability. So the purpose of it was to eliminate, and you're going to see a lot of the wording here where it's not been updated over the years because it goes back to the original section 504. It's been amended, but it will still use some of the terms as handicap, some of the older terms that were used many years ago. But the purpose of it is so that everyone, regardless if they have a disability or not, can access a program and can participate equally with others. So under each one of these sections, a private education, the recipient that provides private elementary or secondary education, and it was very specific, stating the private school that provides the education on the basis of the disability exclude a qualified person with a disability if the person can, with minor adjustments, be provided an appropriate education. So that's very important there. Within, the recipient, talking about the private school's program or activity. A recipient to which this section applies may not charge more for the provision of an appropriate education just because they have a disability. Like if you decide you're going to let me in, you can't decide to charge me $1,000 more because I have that disability than you would someone without a disability who gets accepted. So that you can't do that. A recipient to which the section applies that provides special education shall do so, and there are some guidelines there that you provided in regard. Now, again, keep in mind, 504, there are not additional funds that comes to the school. Many times the things, again, it's going to go back to kind of thinking, what is reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification. Those are going to be the things to keep in mind throughout this. So a lot of times, if they have a disability, the private school, now again, there's not a requirement that you have a 504 plan in place, but a 504 plan is what many times is used to accommodate that. And that's what's also used by the public school. So this is not like a state approved that they have to use it, but these are just some tips that we always share about coming up with the 504 plan. Be specific, what needs to be in there. It can look however, but you come together and you meet, and who, what, when, where, and how is it going to be provided? What is needed? What accommodation? Who's responsible for providing that? So the more specific, the better. Make sure that the 504 meeting and conference summary gives an accurate picture of what took place. There are some examples of, again, and this, your 504 plan could look very different. And if they qualify under 504, I would ask to where 504 applies, I would ask the private school to write a 504 plan. Now, this is sort of an example of what one could look like. That, Kevin will be provided consultation time with the school behavior specialist. It might be that the school has that on hand, a therapist, a counselor, and that we're making sure in the plan that they have access to them when they're needed, right? Accommodations behavior management strategy. It may be a child, they do so much better with behavior if they have a visual schedule, right? They know what to expect. Because when they don't, that's when you may see some negative behavior. So it could be that accommodation was provided is a schedule, a daily schedule. The teacher works with them. And if there is a special education teacher or behavior specialist looking at, some specific training, there are so many resources, and especially looking at private school, maybe not all of the teachers are trained and know. So especially as parents, that we could be very helpful if there's something that's helped us to understand or to put into place for our child, share that with them in the 504 meeting. Have it as part of a training like this, talks about just watch this 3-minute video to understand what ADHD is. Many times, um, they may not even understand the disability and how it affects them. So there are some different things that you could build in. To that, again, this is just one example. Be very outlined, like these are some accommodations, organization, writing homework assignments in a planner, organizing, extra set of books to keep at home, provide provide the student with a quiet area for testing, in-class individual work. So it may be that they need that individual space. Impulsivity, give agreed on signals. So you notice all of these things on here actually cost no additional money, cause no undue hardship. These are simple things that would be reasonable accommodations and modifications that could be put into place. Now, you may ask, who oversees that? Well, the Office of Civil Rights oversees that and enforces that. There is actually a link to that to learn more, just like for ADA, the Department of Justice. But especially related to education, you would do the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. There are different Office of Civil Rights within different agencies at the government level when it comes to when you're talking about 504. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute, and I know that I'm working on running over, but there's so much more to cover. First, I need to ask, are there any questions?
Yes, Rhonda, there is a question. Will the webinar be available to rewatch?
Absolutely. And I will make sure too, because I know I can already tell you I have so many more slides that I'm going to go over 12 by a lot. So if you're not able to hang in there with us for the entire time, just know that it's being recorded. And once we have it accurately closed captioned, we will have it uploaded to our YouTube and you can access that. So I hope I've been explaining this to where, I have to put it into, I joke and say Rhonda terms, like I have to be able to associate it to, oh, you're welcome, associate it to my life and how I can take it and apply. So now we're going to get into the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, this is a specific,
Rhonda, we do have another question that says,
yeah.
excuse me, if you have a homeschool, do you have to file a 504 with anyone?
No, and actually, you don't have to file you don't have to file a 504 with anyone. And I'm glad you asked that. And one of the things, if you have a homeschool, you could develop your own. Use a template. You can develop your own 504 plan. Let me go back here. So the only time that you really is if you're going to file a complaint. If you're a private school, you don't have to, and you've developed a 504 plan for a child, you don't have to file it with anybody, right? And if you're a homeschool, which is a private school, you don't have to either. It is just there that you use with the school. Now, what may occur is if you're not in agreement and you want to file a complaint on that private school, then you may have to, in your complaint, file the 504 that's in place during the time, the 504 that was in place during the time of what occurred in the complaint that you're filing. You may have to attach it, but there's nobody that you have to physically file these with, the private school or that. But I hope that answered the question. So when we look, and again, I'll say it again, and I'm like broken record, and y'all gonna be like, Rhonda, please quit, okay? But so with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there are different parts of the law. We're going to concentrate on the Part B, Public Schools 3 through 21. I'm going to further take that down that we are concentrating on if they are permanently placed in private school. This is anything that we're going to talk about, the regulations and the also Kentucky administrative regulations, which align with the different parts of IDEA, it's only parentally placed in private school because there are different sets of guidelines and regulations if they are in the public school. Now, anywhere that you see throughout here that says SEA, State Education Agency, Kentucky is the Kentucky Department of Education, or KDE. Anywhere that you see LEA is the local education agency, that would be your public school district for which you live in Kentucky. So that's just important to keep in mind. Now, whereas ADA and 504 are civil rights law, IDEA is a specific education law. And it's important to note that there is additional funding that comes at the federal and state level to local districts to provide the specially designed instruction and related services and provide services under IDEA so that persons with disabilities that qualify have what they need. Now, not every person diagnosed with a disability is going to qualify under IDEA. So when we're talking about the definition of a disability that would qualify, it's going to be the same regardless if you are attending public school or private school. So when we're looking at the definition, it is a child's disability must show an adverse effect that impedes progress where educational performance is significantly and consistently below the level of children of similar age. Must also, in addition, meet the criteria of one or more disability categories and need specially designed instruction and related services. You have to need all of this and hit all of this criteria to qualify under IDEA. Now, I wanted to make sure, hold on,
Rhonda, we do have a question in the chat. Does significant behavioral problems affecting their ability to learn meet this criteria?
So, I cannot speak on behalf of the individual situation, but a child was diagnosed as well with autism. So this is a perfect example, and I'm glad you asked this, is what I would do, because here are the disability categories, right? So it could be very likely that the behavioral problems and the autism is adversely affecting them, right? So what I would suggest is that child needs to be evaluated under the autism category, under the emotional behavioral disability category, and there may be others here, but I would look very specifically at the categories because it would be very likely that they may. Now, each one has different criteria depending upon the category, right? But I would definitely have them evaluated. Now, I hope that helps to answer that. So yes, it is very possible that they could, but I can't tell you a definite on the individual situation. But I would definitely refer, which we'll talk about here in a minute, refer them to be evaluated. Now, let's see here. Now, because this is, we're going to get into, because a lot of times people do believe, you're welcome, people do believe, well, if they go to private school, they gave up their right to qualify and get services under IDEA. That's not true. There are the specific sections of IDEA that have regulations in place for children who are parentally placed in private school, as does our Kentucky administrative regulations, which aligns right with IDEA. But here are some things to keep in mind, and this is, you can, on all of this, you can click right here and access this. So it's not just Rhonda, go to, and I believe this is the, if you click on this one, the different one, I think this is the private school plan, I'll link there, or it is 707 Kara 1370. But throughout here, you will get the link to these laws, and it'll make more sense in a minute. But I wanted to put this here because it established standards for school districts to make appropriate educational services available for children with disabilities. Private school child with a disability does not have the individual right to receive all of the special education and related services that he or she would receive if enrolled in the public school. So it's not that you're going to get everything that you would if you were in the public school, right? But you still could be entitled to get some services. You may receive those services in a different way, a different amount of services than you would, because if you qualify under IDEA, there's not an IEP that's written for you. If you're parentally placed in private school, again, parentally placed in private school, an IEP, individual education program, is not written for you. A private school service plan is written. And when a parent decides, which is your choice, and you have every right to make it if you want your child to be homeschooled or attend private school. But if you're wanting to do that, if you've decided to place them in private school and don't take the offer of the FAPE, free appropriate public education, that the district could provide at no cost to you, then what will be done is a private school service plan. Now, within it, because we're going to talk about too, there's not all of the procedural safeguards, parents' rights that you would normally see under IEP, but there are some, and we'll kind of go over that. But I wanted to give this sort of overview, and you'll notice in the blank state-approved private school service plan, this is right there on the top of that. So what is different? So there is a thing called, if you're not familiar, child find that's all throughout IDEA, or public schools and private. It very specifically in IDEA states that the public school district still has child find responsibilities, meaning that the LEA, the local public school district, has a responsibility to locate, identify, and evaluate children with disabilities who are enrolled by their parents in private schools. When we look at that, that there is that requirement, you'll see here too that that's the requirement also in our Kentucky administrative regulations. These activities should be comparable, and you're going to start seeing that throughout here. That's why we know what process we need to do. These activities of the child find in our Kentucky administrative activities, our administrative regulations says that it'd be comparable to the activities to locate, identify, and evaluate children as if the same as if they were in public school. So what that tells us is when we go over here to where what would be our initial first step, you submit a referral to the public school district. And this, one of the questions there, that we had about, do you feel that this disability will qualify, the behavioral and the autism, when I suggested send the referral so they're evaluated. So even if you're homeschooling private school, send a letter, and we put here a link to the Department of Education's district and school directory. Send a letter to the head of special education for the district, and that you are requesting them be evaluated. Also, in addition, I love to go above that. Any of the possible categories that you feel that they may qualify under, put those in there. Now, the school has 60 school days from the date. Now, you send the referral, then you have to sign the parental consent to evaluate before they can evaluate your child. That's the same as if you were in public or private school. They also have 60 school days to have that evaluation done from the date that you signed the parental consent. Now,
Rhonda, I'm sorry to interrupt. I had a question sent to me. As far as LEA in the referral process, who qualifies under the LEA to send in a referral for a student? And would there pediatrician or specialist that they are currently seeing be able to send in the referral?
Great question. And I'm glad you brought it up because normally I cover that and I didn't. I'm like in a zone. Anyone who has knowledge of the child can refer the child for an evaluation. That could be a teacher. That could be a doctor. That could be a therapist outside of school. That could be the parent. Anyone can refer the child. Now, then the next step is the parent needs to sign the parental consent to evaluate, because until that's signed, then we can't start the process, because that is part of the law that parental consent has to be given to evaluate. But anyone can. And we have many service providers who send referrals in. So I hope, did I catch all of the areas of that, Amber?
Yes, I think one thing else to clarify is, so if it is the student's pediatrician or specialist or something they are seeing, will the private school or school recognize that referral as special education services?
Okay, but see, what I'm talking about right now is not being handled. When I'm talking about, and I'm glad you said that, the stuff I'm talking about right now, that idea and sending the referral, has nothing to do, and the private school's not involved, unless people at the private school are one of the ones submitting the referral. Okay, this is through the public school district that you are requesting, the head of special education for the public school district. You are requesting the evaluation, because it's not the private school that's going to do the evaluation. It's not the private school that has these requirements under IDEA and 504. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we have to keep it's about as clear as mud when you're trying to look at all these laws and keep it separated and knowing what thing. Now, I'm going to tell you here in a little bit where the private school would probably play a role if they're not playing a role by they send a referral, right? Where they would play a role in this, okay? But right now, the child find responsibilities, the evaluation, all of that, that is the public school district's responsibility. Does that kind of help clarify?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, now there are going to be, most of the time we're asked, okay, well, what's the evaluation look like? Well, it's going to depend on what category they're being evaluated for. Well, okay, Mary, you are just fine, because that is not to worry. One of the things is when you look at the different evaluations that are going to be conducted, go look at the Kentucky Department of Education forms, the eligibility determination. So you're going to be able to tell what's being looked for under each one of those categories. And when you click on that link, if you look over to your far right, you're going to see all the categories eligibility determination forms. So I highly encourage you to look at that. Now, also the evaluation, if you don't agree with the evaluation that comes back, you do have the right to an independent education evaluation at no cost to you. You request that through the public school district. And what has to take place is then everybody, when those results come back, it's not a given they're going to qualify, but when those results come back, those results at least have to be taken into consideration as you're determining if they qualify as a team. Again, the parent is an equal member of the team, and this is to be a team decision. It's not just based on one piece of data, one test that they have. It's to be a combination, the evaluation is, and give an overall picture of where the child currently is. So you do have that right you can access. And again, this brings us back all of those things that we just talked about when it had to do about the referral, the evaluation timeline, the right to independent education evaluation. Those were all things, I hopped this back here, that tied in and stated, and how you can go back and know that that is something that your child would be entitled to if they attend a private school, is that we stated in our Kentucky regulations that these activities have to be comparable to the activities to locate, identify, and evaluate children with disabilities, just as we do in the public school. So that's how that ties back. Now, now we've had the evaluation and our child qualifies, right? So now is where it starts looking a little different because they attend the private school. Now, I put on here the IDEA regulations, and again, I apologize for going over. If you have to leave, we will have the recording that will be available at a later date for you. But when we look at, there's a section in IDEA and in CARA that is about basic requirements. One of the requirements of services for parentally placed in private school, basic requirement is the schools have to, because remember back as part of our state law that you have to report children that are in private school, right? And this would be homeschool. And so it needs to, the funds and services provided, it's stating under the federal law that to the extent, looking at the number of children within that district that are on, that attend private schools that have a disability, who are enrolled by their parents, you need to provide, those services consistent with the average of students that are there. So one thing that's very important, but is we need to make sure that people with their child, if they want, who have a disability but attend private school, are accessing these rights, are accessing these services, because it is not a known fact. Most everybody that I talked to, and for many years, this was my understanding too, is that if you decide to private school, then you don't have any rights under that. And it's a huge misconception that we're trying to educate people on, that there are things. But it is important because it is they're going to look at the average number, right? So there are some things in there that, are important so that we're getting that representation there. Because again, we see here, to the extent consistent with the number and location of these children enrolled in private schools located within the school district boundaries, right? So they have to take a portion of their funds and use and look at it in relation to the number and location of students who have disabilities in private schools. So it also states that there be a service plan developed for parentally placed in private school for children who had qualified who have a disability. Again, this is where you're going to see differences, where if you're through the public school system, an IEP is developed. Now, this is where there's a service plan that's developed, and it must be developed and implemented for each private school student with a disability designated by the LEA, the local public school district in which the private school is located, to receive the special education related services. Because remember, if they qualify, they need specially designed instruction and related services. Now, record keeping, there's a part of it too, that there has to be, the number of children evaluated, determined eligible, and the number receiving the services. So those are some very specific things at the federal and state level that have to be recorded. Now, there's a big part of the law, and you're going to see here in IDEA and then in Kentucky Administrative Regulations, that talks about consultation. And so I know you may be thinking, well, what does consultation have to do with it? Well, consultation, this is where now I'm going to bring back, remember when I said I'll bring up involvement when the private school needs to be involved into this, right? There's not requirements under IDEA that makes the private school do something that I am aware of or have been able to find. But consultation in it and part of the team is a lot of times you will see that the school district will develop a memorandum of understanding or agreement with the private school. Now, this doesn't mean they're going to pay for your child to go to private school. That's not what this means. Developing, because it'll be in consultation to come up with a plan. Because you remember back IDEA, what IDEA in the services, especially design instruction related services, is not to provide the education. It's to provide the specially designed instruction related services that you need to be able to benefit from the education, right? So it's not that they're providing that education. And there's another regulation here that I'm going to show you where people get confused. It doesn't mean that they're going to pay for your child to go to school there and pay the tuition if they're parentally placed in private school. What it means is at no cost to you, what's developed in a private service plan that's provided by the local education agency, public school district, right? Now, it may be, and I saw and heard that some private schools work very well and are part of the team for a private school plan. But, you know, working with them and everybody, they would be critical to be a part of the team to sort of come up with that. And, you know, the parents, the private school, the public school, everybody is a part of the team, any service provider. But again, there's not a requirement that I am aware of that requires the private school to do it. Now the share of the funds, there is a way that they can determine to share the funds that are available for privately placed. But again, that's going to be determined on the funds, on the proportionate share of, remember, we went back to how many in the district are private schools that are students with disabilities. Those things are going to play a role. It could be that some of those services are provided, which we'll talk about a little bit more here, is it's going to be very specific, the consultation process. How are we as the private school and public school district and the officials going to work together? There have been many cases to where the private school doesn't want anything to do with it. It is the parent, just the parent that is there with that. You can have totally isolated, you know, they attend the private school, but then we also have a private school plan that the parent and the students involved with in getting the services and support. And what would be critical if the private school is not involved in that is the parent and the student themselves explaining the areas that they're having difficulty, where they may not be with their similar age peers, to where we can work and develop goals that will address that. And especially design instruction related services that could help with that. Now, part of the stuff too is, you know, deciding how, where, and by whom is the special education and related service going to be provided that's in the private school plan. Now, the type of service, including direct service and alternate service provided. How is it's going to be divided out? How are we determining it? How and when those decisions will be made? So written explanation of all of that about the services has to be drawn up and developed. Now, if the local education agency disagrees with the views of the private school officials of the services or types of services, whether they're provided directly or through a contract, the LEA will provide to the private school officials a written explanation of the reasons why the LEA chose not to provide those services directly or through the contract, right? They can choose to do a contract with them, but they cannot choose to and provide it themselves as the public school too. So just know that those things can occur. So, and in the in Tara, also looking at the consultation, the child fine process, determining the share of the federal funds and how it's calculated, consultation process, how are we going to operate, what's been developed, looking at, this is why it's important to know your public school district's policies and procedures that they have developed specifically related to parentally placed in private schools. I think, okay, thank you. One of the things that that's really important to keep in mind here is, the specifics. Who's going to do it? Who's decided to do it? And how is it going to get done, right? The role that everyone feels that they play, that have agreed upon. So equitable services provided. There is a specific spot in IDEA that talks about equitable services provided if you're parentally placed in a private school. And it would be based on the same standards that you would as if you were providing the services in the public school. The exception to the private elementary and secondary school teachers who are providing the equitable services to parentally placed in private school children with disabilities do not have to meet special education teacher requirements in. So that's something that's important to know, is that they don't have to meet those special education teacher qualifications to provide the certain service. But that outside of that, that it needs to be comparable to what's provided to the public school, the qualified person, right? One of the things too, you can receive a different amount of services than children placed in, and it says it in IDEA, than children who are placed in the public school. Now, the services stated in the service plan, it's, you decide and you designate the services that will be received. You also have to be very specific on how those services are going to be received. Looking at, there are different requirements, say if they're the age 3 through 5, than if they were the 6 through 21. So it's very important to know those differences depending upon the child's age. They do have to be developed, reviewed, and revised consistent with, so you would at least have an annual private school service plan meeting. But you could request one at any time. If there are some concerns that you need to address, things have changed, you can bring that up. Now, one of the things here too is that I want to point out, special education related services provided to parentally placed private school children with disabilities, including materials and equipment, must be neutral. It must, they're very specific in the federal and in the state law that it cannot be biased, or it has to be remain very neutral. So you will see that this aligns right with that, so that you know the section that it comes out of, the where it aligns right with the federal law in there in our services that are provided. Now, there's the other section about location of services and transportation. This is another thing, like, remember when I stated, this doesn't mean if they qualify, they're going to pay your tuition for private school. This is also another example. This doesn't mean that if you qualify, that they are going to transport your child to the private school and home. That's not what this is. When we're talking about location of services and transportation, that is the services that are stating in your private school service plan. So say if it happened to be speech therapy, well, you would have transportation, you would be able to benefit so that you could participate. There would be transportation provided for the speech therapy. Now, I can give you a perfect example where you might not need to even have transportation for the speech therapy. Is, say that you are working and there's an agreement and your private school is on board and agree that they're part of the private school plan, and they allow, as part of the mutual agreement between the private and the public school district, they allow the speech therapist to come into the school to do the speech therapy. So in that case, the child's already there at school. There would be no requirement for that speech therapy to provide the transportation. Now, it does further go down and explain it depends on the timing of the service, right? It could be at the site of the private school. It could be at the child's home, depending upon that. But in no way can you use it as they're going to get my child to school and back, right? Because that's not what the intent of this is. Now, it could be that if the speech therapist doesn't come to school, they could have, if it's during the school hours and everybody's in agreement, they could pick up the child from the private school, transport them to the therapy, transport them back to school. So that could be agreed upon. Same goes where if it's a child's home. So say you are homeschooling your child, which is private school, they could pick up your child and take them to therapy. They can bring them back home. The same could be if you're in agreement as being the private school in your home, that you agree that they can come in and do that. The speech therapist can come in and do that therapy. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Now, if you remember, I stated about there's a little bit of a difference about procedural safeguards and parents' rights. So there is, and this, we won't dig deep into this, but there are some safeguards that are in place. So, but not all the due process rights do you have except for the child fine. Like you can, you have the due process rights of that. Now, there's also child fine complaints that you can file, which is under the federal and the state law, that that you can file a complaint, that the private school can file the complaint regarding the services that were not, but the child fines requirement as well. Now, looking at the state complaint down here is, so there'd be a child fine complaint or a state complaint. So let me go back because I said that very confusing a minute ago. So the parent can do a child fine complaint and the private school could too. Now, a state complaint could be, and the child fine complaint would be a state complaint as well, but the state complaint also, that could be filed by the private school official, that there's another complaint that the private school can file as well. Now, keep in mind, if you're homeschooling, you are the private school, so you can file that. So you would still have some rights there. But just keep in mind, it's not exactly like it would be if they attend the public school. Again, it lays it out here. Looking at private school officials has the right to submit a state written complaint. It could be about not engaging in a timely and meaningful consultation, not giving due consideration to the views of the private school officials. So there are some very specific things in the Kentucky administrative regulations as well, but just know that it looks a little different than it would if they were attending the public school. So there are some areas in that just I thought were important to bring up in the federal, and then looking at the state. In there's a requirement that the funds not benefit a private school, right? These funds are not to benefit you. Like I can use an example because these funds are there for that child, right? To help benefit that child so that they can receive an appropriate education, right? A free appropriate education. So one of the examples would be looking at, and it gives the example here, general needs of the student enrolled in the private school. So if you're in the private school and you, the curriculum, the private school can't use this fund to buy a curriculum to teach all of its students, right? Because that should be a given that your child had access to the general curriculum, right? It's not your child's funding responsibility to fund the school to be able to get the curriculum for all the students. The funding would be used to be able to assist that child in accessing that curriculum successfully. So I hope that kind of helps make sense. Now, it prohibits in there separate classes. So the local education agency may not use the funds available for classes that are organized separately on the basis of the school enrollment or religion of the child. If the classes are at the same site, the classes include children in public schools and children enrolled in private schools. So they have some very specific things about, you can't have the segregation there. So that's just important to know. Now, property, equipment, and supplies. The public agency has to keep record of stuff. So if there's equipment that they have purchased that the child uses to benefit and is part of their private school plan, that is actually the local education agency's property. Now, I will tell you the thing that you need to keep in mind too is if that was purchased under the child's medical card or their own private insurance, that is that child's property. But for the purposes here explaining this, any of those funds used for that equipment, property, materials is property of the school out of IDEA funds. What's going to be important is knowing what funds provided it, okay? So keep that in mind. Now, looking at, Kira also goes by and looks at the instruction, otherwise benefits of private school right here. It's not IDEA Part B's responsibility to fund the instruction, right? Now, it would be what's in a private school plan of, say, your goals or objectives or any special education that the child is receiving in their private school plan. Again, it goes by and this shows you how this aligns with the other, with the federal law. Now, so this is the example of the private school plan, the state level, and you can click right on this. But I want to kind of show you, if you're familiar with looking at the IEP, this is going to start looking a little different. Again, because it doesn't include everything that the other will have. So you are going to have there again, that we started out with that Sarah 707 Sarah 1370 part. It's going to be very specific. What's the private school placement? What's the name? Is it what school is it? What district is the child? Because it could be that you are a resident of one area, but you attend the private school in a different district, right? So it's going to be the responsibility of the school district where the child attends the school. So you're going to write annual goals, short benchmarks, short-term objectives. It's going to be really important to figure out what where your child currently is, right? Have a good picture so that you can write really effective annual goals that are going to help them. There's also a section that talks about special education. Is it, some special education from a special education teacher? Is it a therapist? What's exactly needed? And here again, who attended the meeting and what are we agreeing upon? What are steps to be provided? Very specific. Now, there are some other additional resources here that you can access. I know that I have went so far over, but I hope that this has been helpful. One thing that I do want to, I'm going to pause right here. Or I'm going to tell you something, but if there's any questions, please let me know in the chat. I hope that this has been helpful. But there is so much more that could be covered on this. But one of the things that I get asked a lot, because many times if families have homeschooled their child or they're in private school and they're thinking about re-enrolling in them in the public school, but they want to make sure that there are things in place like an IEP before they do it, right? They want to make sure that they're going to enter with the services and support that they need. So here's one way that you can do that is say that you are homeschooling them, get them evaluated, if they qualify, get a private school service plan in place. Because what will happen, your child's qualifying, right? They qualified under IDEA to receive special education and related services. Then you decide to enroll them in the public school. So they've already qualified, right? They're still under that, and you're at least reevaluated, same as comparable. Remember, the locate, identify, and evaluate. It's similar to if you attended public school at least every 3 years. So they have a current evaluation in place. They would then, if you enroll them back in there, they would switch from a private school plan to an IEP, and they would get more services and supports that way. So that's one way you can ensure that smooth transition to where they continue to get their services and support. But if you know that there is a certain time that you want them to start, say right now, if you know next year you want to enroll them in special back in the school district, start right now, send that referral, get them identified, get a private school service plan put in place so that when you go to enroll them in school, you will switch from the private school plan to the IEP. And we can help you understand more and have more information about IEP as well. Let's see, I think there's a question here. No. Yeah, so this is a great question. Do you know if you can have a service plan but refuse the services? So just keeping it open for the future, but you know the transportation to the services would be impossible. Okay, so you could refuse it. So one of the things that's similar, and just like if you attend a public school, say if your child qualifies, you have to give consent to receive services. So if I'm understanding right, it's not that you want to deny getting a private service plan. It's just there may be certain portions of it that you refuse, right? And I have a little bit of question about how the transportation might be impossible because some of the things and what's supposed to be worked on that and through the private school plan is how do we make that accessible to be able to provide it. So really working the local education agency, working to provide that in a way that the service can be accessed, right? So look at those barriers. So I know that's a total side note, but there may be certain things that you decide or you feel that it's not important to work on or to have as a part of it at the time. So I would bring that up as in there at the ARC admissions and release committee meeting that you'll have the for private school plan is, and as a part of that team that you don't want to have that as part of it right now, but us to relook at that in the future, possibly adding that. And again, everybody's to come up with an agreement that you shouldn't not be able to continue to access your service plan if there's one thing that you don't access at this moment. But then I also want to go back to what have we done to make it where it makes it feasible to access it, right? So that brings up a lot of questions and I go down rabbit holes. So there's a lot of things there though that we could look at and try to figure out how do we make it accessible. But again, I guess you could refuse different stuff, but make sure you're clear you're not refusing the private school service plan unless that's what you want to do, because you do have the right when they're evaluated to refuse it. Make sure you're very specific that you're not refusing the private school plan, the services, that it's just one portion that you do not wish them to receive. So that's going to be very important, and make sure that that is documented very clearly in the conference summary. I hope that helps. So does anyone else, I can't believe you all stuck with me. So I'm very grateful for you all. Is there any questions that you all have? Has it been helpful? And we're going to put in the chat a link to the evaluation.